It is a real pleasure to be moderating this panel. I am in awe of all the experts that are here tonight, and so glad that so many of you are in attendance. Many of you will be education workers, researchers, parents, maybe students. So thank you so much for joining us. I should introduce myself. I am Kristina Llewellyn. I go by the pronouns she, her. I'm a professor in the Department of Social Development Studies. Social Development Studies at Renison has a very unique undergraduate specialization in education. So a lot of the students go on to work in the education sector or work with children and youth. I'm also very proud to be the co-investigator with the Equity Knowledge Network, which is co-sponsoring this event tonight. And I have to give a special shout out to lots of the equity in education students that I have that might be joining us tonight. I am teaching a fourth-year seminar course right now in equity in education. And so I know they're all very excited to be able to attend this panel as well. So a shout out to all those students who are here tonight. So let me introduce the incredible four panelists. To begin with, I'd like to introduce Vidya Shah. Dr. Shah is an educator, scholar, and activist who is committed to equity and racial justice in the service of liberatory education. She is an assistant professor in education at York University, and her research explores anti-racist approaches, specifically with respect to leadership in schools, communities, and school districts. She has worked in the Model Schools for Inner Cities program with the Toronto District School Board and was an elementary school teacher in the TDSB as well. Dr. Shah is committed to bridging the gaps between communities, classrooms, school districts, and the academy to reimagine, which is what we hope to do a little bit tonight, to reimagine the emancipatory possibilities for schooling. Next, I would like to introduce Behan Farhadi. Dr. Farhadi is a postdoctoral fellow at York University in the Faculty of Education and a research associate with the incredible Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She researches online learning and its impact on equity in public education. Her current project is with Dr. Sue Winton, focusing on teacher policy enactment during COVID, specifically in Alberta and Ontario. Dr. Behan is also a secondary school teacher in the Toronto District School Board and an incredible, powerful advocate, I would add, for a fully funded anti-oppressive public education system. Next, Joel Westheimer. Dr. Westheimer is a university research chair in democracy and education at the University of Ottawa and is a regular education columnist with the CBC Radio. Author, speaker, and education activist, he also co-directs the Inequality Project, which investigates what North American schools are teaching about economic inequality. Dr. Westheimer grew up in New York City, where he was a middle school teacher in the New York City public schools before getting his PhD from Stanford. His books include the critically acclaimed What Kind of Citizen? Educating Our Children for the Common Good, Pledging Allegiance, The Politics of Patriotism in America's Schools, and Among School Teachers, Community, Autonomy, and Ideology in Teachers' Work. In addition to researching the role of schools in democratic societies, Dr. Westheimer studies, writes, and speaks widely on global reform initiatives, including the accountability onslaught and the politics of education more broadly. And last but certainly not least, introduction for Llewellyn Chanaka, who is the Director of Education for the Waterloo Region District School Board, serving approximately 64,000 students and their families, 10,000 staff members across 122 schools. Over his 20 years as an educator, he was principal in the York Region District School Board, also served as superintendent of equity, anti-racism, and anti-oppression, and as superintendent of schools for the Toronto District School Board, among many, many other roles. Llewellyn holds a Master's of Education from York, a Bachelor of Education from the University of Toronto, and a Bachelor of Arts from York University as well. He is recognized internationally for his work in innovation, social justice advocacy, and anti-racism. He is one of a select group of global senior education leaders selected as a TED-Ed innovative educator, and he delivered his talk, at the TED Summit in Scotland in 2019. So welcome to all of you. And when I said it was an impressive panel, you can see just by those introductions how impressive it is. Briefly, I want to say that we're going to use sort of a Q&A format with myself and the panelists for about 45 minutes. And then we will try to reserve 30 minutes for the Q&A questions that hopefully you will add to the Q&A section. We do have a large number of registrants. In fact, the last total we heard was 600. So that's a large number of people. We do want everyone to actively engage in the Q&A, but apologies if we won't be able to get to everyone. We'll try to cluster some of the questions together and touch upon the topics that are most important to all of you. So I'm going to begin I'll do the questions in two parts. And again, I want the panelists to feel free to jump in if there's something that another person says that they want to address. But I wanted to start with talking about the current state, the pandemic state of education, and then move on to how we can do that reimagining and talk about what the future could look like. So just to start, maybe we could all quickly think about, and I mean just concisely in about a minute, what has stood out for each of you as one of the most major impacts of the pandemic on education? And perhaps we'll start with Llewellyn.
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and on this panel tonight. You know, I think the pandemic only helped to make very visible something that many of us have been talking about for a long time, which is the inequities that exist. You know, I don't think there's any thing new about that other than it became really, really very evident and just how challenging the moment was. You know, and it sort of intersected at a moment in history for us where more people, in particular Indigenous, Black, racialized folks, as well as more people as they grow in their consciousness and awareness, have been calling on institutions to do better and to be better. And that includes us in education. And so, you know, it really made evident many of the issues of marginalization that exist. You know, for some groups, you know, we saw in particular for families who are coming out of poverty, some of the assumptions that people had around technology and technology access. I would say, you know, it exacerbated because we saw which particular families were differentially impacted in terms of, you know, Indigenous, Black, racialized families, the impact on children with special needs. And also, I think the other thing that it did was make very clear the significance of need to focus on well-being and mental health. You know, if I could, you know, maybe say, you know, two other things really quickly. I think one of the things that's become really clear to us, something that, you know, I refer to right now as it's also made clear an issue around environmental poverty, in terms of how we access the environment, who has access to it or does not have access to it. And I think out of that has shown us very clearly that when systems want to prioritize things and to pivot, that we can pivot and we can prioritize things and shift things in a way that actually gets us to think differently. And so, you know, maybe I'll just pause there so that, you know, others can go and we can pick up the conversation some more.
Thanks so much. I'll pass it over to Behan.
So I'll build on that. For me, what stood out was the interdependence of health, education, and the economy. It's also stood out to me the impact the pandemic has had on the architecture of education. So I think we think about walls and doors, and now we're really talking like networks and portals. And really, it's to me, and I think sort of building on what Llewellyn said, is it in some ways, especially with regards to access and equity of access, troubled some of the fantasies we had around the promise of online education in a public education system that the mission for which is, you know, democratic and common. So I'll leave it with that.
Vidya?
Yeah, I agree with everything that you and Behan have shared. And, you know, just adding to that is this idea of we've really seen a kind of truth telling that has happened in this moment, that there are many people that are sharing various versions of their truths that are coming out. And at times we're seeing massive polarization in how people are taking that up. And at times we're seeing mass collectivization in how people are thinking through this. And I think that there's something to be said about being in a time where we are literally pulling the veil back and seeing systems and structures and ideas for what they are, and people being you know, more and more comfortable to share what those views are. And at times it feels like, ooh, where are we going with this? And, you know, how far is this going to go? But, you know, it does allow for a kind of critical democracy in which more people are engaging in how they want their lives to be, how they want to live with each other, and how they want public education to pan out for especially those that are most marginalized in the system.
And Joel?
Thanks, Kristina. Yeah, I'll follow up on everyone. It's great to be here on the panel, and it's funny talking about the impact of the pandemic on education when, of course, we're doing this on Zoom, and so this very event is part of the impact of COVID on education, and it's you know what, wonderful, like we can all be here from all over, but it also has shortcomings, like none of us know who's wearing pants and things like that. But I think that the pandemic, like Llewellyn said, it really served as an X-ray to reveal a lot of the problems that we already knew were there in the system. And one example of that is definitely, as several people said, massive inequality, right? We knew the inequalities that were built into the system and that were there before the pandemic. Many people had studied them, but they were now front and center in our face, on our screens. I mean, we were literally in the homes of our students, right? And we could see the difference between a student who was, you know, sharing one laptop with 9 family members and working in a room with other people running around and no space, and another student in their own room with their own fancy desktop computer and all the resources at their disposal. So it really served as this X-ray. And I'll get into more of what I think some of the lessons learned later, obviously, since this is just the kind of opening salvo. But I do want to say that I also think that we learned, you see, right before basically everything that was impossible before the pandemic suddenly overnight became possible, right? So people have been trying for 2 decades to scale back the behemoth that is standardized testing and the control that it had on the curriculum, and then overnight it was gone, right? And now it's crept back, of course, but it showed us that everything is possible and that we have the capacity to make massive changes in the system for the better.
Yeah, in many ways, quite disheartening when you see how inequality was exacerbated, but then also this hopefulness that there are other ways you can do things rapidly if we all collectively have the will to do so. So thanks very much for those opening thoughts. I'm going to come to Llewellyn first to maybe talk more about this pandemic education. And as you noted, when you first spoke, Llewellyn, really about these exacerbated inequalities. And sometimes we don't take into account what that looks like on the ground for what education workers are seeing of these inequalities for students, but also not taking into account how that is impacting the education workers themselves. And in particular, I know being in Waterloo myself, there's been a lot of media coverage and controversies that have happened as of late that seem very polarizing. And I wonder about how it is that education workers might be feeling within that kind of media coverage at the moment that is very polarizing about what is happening on the ground in schools?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kristina. A couple of things. I want to start off by acknowledging the huge level of exhaustion and burnout that educators, and when I talk about educators, I speak about, I'm talking about all our frontline staff, and with all due respect to our medical frontline workers, our school frontline workers are the next set of frontline workers that people often don't acknowledge as such. And the level of burnout and exhaustion that we're seeing right now, in 20 years of my career, I have not seen anything like this, at all levels. Our office staff, our custodians, our support staff, our teachers, our principals, there is just such significant exhaustion. And I really want to acknowledge and honor, because I can't tell you, in as much as that is the case, I've been trying to connect with all of the schools in our region. I've been to roughly half of our 122 schools so far, and everywhere people are like, we're so glad to be back, even though they're as exhausted as anything. So I want to say that as one thing. The other thing that I want to say is that, the work of trying to make sure our schools are equitable and more inclusive is not easy work. And I would go so far to say it's at times not just not easy, there's tons of consequences for pushing against sort of like tradition, notions of the way it used to be, people's sort of sense of, what it should be. And I think, in a public secular system, what we do is we want to honor that all children belong, that all children should be able to come to school and feel safe, feel welcome, and be able to grow into their full self and to be honored for who they are. And when we recognize that, a lot of times the structures as they are have honored some children, but not all, honored some staff and families, but not all, what we're saying is it's good that it's honoring some, but we need to do better, and we can do better. And I think, to your point around some of the pieces in the media, absolutely, when there's change, there's people who react or respond to that. But I think also, recognizing how those things are picked up and what is actually being covered in terms of, is it telling the full story? As we work through some very complex issues, one of the things that we're committed to in our district is to keep trying to work in this idea of that it's all of us versus them and us, even when there's polemics within our community, and at the same time still hold the standard that if we say each and every child matters, each and every one, then we have to do better, and we have to question and honor the fact that right now it's not serving all. And I think, like to the earlier part of our question, we know where those disparities lie. We don't need more research. We don't need more, more studies to happen. It's the same groups of students: Indigenous, Black, racialized, identified learners, special education needs, to us LGBT identifying children coming out of poverty, and then, localized, marginalized populations, to us a lesser extent. Those are who have been historically marginalized. And I think that if it is that we are saying schooling is for all, and that we are a community that honors all people, and that we are welcoming to all, we have to look at our systems and structures. We have to look and see whether or not the policies that we have in place actually do in fact honor. And so, how can we have these difficult conversations and stay in relationship to one another at the table, so to speak, right? And recognizing that some of us have always had access and voice, and some of us have not. And to even know that sometimes we don't know who's not yet at the table. Like when we say who's missing, we don't know what we don't know. And so, you know, in the essence, and trying to go after a public education that actually truly embraces the community and honors the voices of our students means that we need to really think differently and then act differently. And so, you know, I guess the piece that I would say is then we need to have coverage that reflects that, as opposed to maybe being things that are sort of, you know, for lack of a better word, lighting fires and causing fear or harm, to say, you know what, as we work through this, how might we address the emotions that are coming up? How might we address some of the concerns that people have, right? Legitimately so, or maybe it's not. Not that it's not legitimate, but maybe it's not, it's more out of fear. So how do we address that? And I think that's, you know, the stance that we're coming to, especially if we're trying to educate children for life in a global world. And, you know, we know more and more kids are graduating. They're going all over the world. So if we're preparing them for that life in this world, we need to be better and do better so we can create the world we want.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Vidya, very much in line with a lot of Llewellyn's own advocacy work, you're very much focused on equity and justice at the heart of your research and the ways you mobilize knowledge with community. And a lot of what you advocate for is an understanding of how schools are rooted in community. And that idea of schools as places for community, as in support of broader communities, that drastically shifted during the pandemic. So there have been, you know, incredible effects of what happened with school closures, with school-based community services being disrupted. Can you speak a little bit more to that relationship that you explore between the school and community, and what the pandemic has revealed about what is needed in that regard?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kristina. And you know, I think one of the things that's so important for us to continuously think about, and this is what others have said, is that there was an increased awareness for some educators, not all, about the ways in which the different kinds of communities that exist, and the ways in which different communities are cared for, and the response that they get in terms of need. And so one of the things that this pandemic did is it really shone a light on what are the various communities that are connected to our schools that we have really been ignoring, that we have not seen, that have existed there, that have been resisting in many ways, but have not been acknowledged. And so I'm thinking in particular about, you know, as Llewellyn was sharing earlier, families that are marginalized by poverty and are experiencing housing and food insecurity. And you know, I'm thinking about families who have migrant workers in their families, and they're thinking about, you know, how do we actually acknowledge that so many workers have been brought to Canada to farm these lands that were deemed too unsafe for quote unquote Canadians to farm during COVID. You know, when we think about folks that are you know, without status or non-status, we think about Indigenous families, especially families on reserve and boil water advisories. Like there's so many pieces that were brought to the forefront around the various communities that make up our school. And I think one of the questions that we need to sit with and sit in the discomfort of is, why have we not seen this as a collective prior to what COVID-19 has revealed? And even as COVID-19 is revealing this, why are, you know, as Gloria Latson-Billings and others have talked about, we're living in multiple pandemics. It's not just COVID-19. We are living in a time, you know, the you know, white supremacy and racial injustice pandemic, climate injustice is a pandemic, the growing disparity between the rich and the poor is a pandemic. And why haven't we acknowledged the effects of those pandemics on communities? And so this is really, you know, where it's an opportunity for us to question whose harm has been censored, whose stories have been believed, whose suffering has been erased. And why is it that, you know, what was it about COVID-19 and who was impacted by COVID-19 that, as Joel shared, all of a sudden there's all this political will to rapidly change things in education that people have been calling for a long time? And so it speaks to this idea of whose lives matter. It speaks to this idea of which lives are deemed disposable. It speaks to these ideas of whose stories are believed. It speaks to this idea of, you know, who gets to determine when it's actually a pandemic, right? Whose voice gets to determine that. And so I think what all of this has done is it's reinforced schools as really the hub of the community, recognizing that there are many different notions of community, right? There's the geographic community, there are identity-based communities, but there's also sociopolitical, economic, historic communities that are surrounding the schools and that are differentially related to schooling. And so the question becomes, how might schools become sites of community care? And when we think about the number of families, especially Black and other racialized families that kept their children home from school during the pandemic because their children would experience less harm being at home than going to school, we need to be asking ourselves what is happening. And I'm a classroom teacher at heart, and this is not you know, throwing shade at individual teachers. This is a question of why systemically have we allowed patterns of behaviors, have we allowed so many structures and policies to exist that continue to harm students? Why is it that parents are choosing to keep their children home to protect their children from school? That says something. This is feedback. This is, you know, information that we need to be taking very seriously about what families have been saying and what communities have been saying is the harm being done to their children in schools. And so this is a time of community uprisings. This is a time of really people and families speaking out about what's happening. And it's a time for us to not just listen and understand, that's at minimum what we need to be doing, but to act to disrupt these patterns that have existed for so long and that have harmed so many.
Yeah, I mean, I was very much struck during the pandemic when you would hear of families saying, well, it's a safer place for my child to be at home than in schools, because they were facing, you know, various forms of harm, and including racism in the school community. And then what some commentators took that to mean is, look, online schooling is better for some students, rather than, well, no, why aren't we being attentive to what is happening in person in our public schools? Which sort of gets me to Behan. I'm wondering if you could draw upon your research as well, that has really brought attention to the rise of privatization of public education, particularly with respect to online learning. And, you know, you've spoken about, again, how the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities in public education, specifically regarding technology and these kind of public-private resource partnerships. Could you speak a bit more about that?
Sure, and I appreciate you mentioning that the response isn't, you know, online education is great when a student is harmed. It's that we need to have a safe access for a student to be in school. Online learning shouldn't be it's not a choice, right? If it's a choice between harm and survival. So I guess like the easiest way to answer that, I'll give the easy answer and the more challenging answer. The easy answer is that the way that we sort of saw sort of more proper public-private partnerships emerge is with edtech philanthropy, or you've got the distribution of free iPads to students, subsidized, perhaps is a better way to put it. So TDSB had, I remember like in spring, during the initial school closures, they bought 6,000 iPads to serve as part of a program to serve 30,000 families, and Peel were distributing 20,000 devices and 2,000 internet sticks. We really saw that this idea that the city was connected, disrupted too. Even the public library was distributing connections to the internet, and we also see the importance of the library also as part of the community. So all of these sort of public services, the interdependence. And so that's the the response to the first state of emergency that we had in the spring. But of course, that was a response to a policy directive that required educators to deliver online education without time or preparation, right? And so these opportunities were not accessed evenly. It's especially with regards to this idea of like continuity of learning, and these devices that we sort of had such enthusiastic coverage about in the media got into students weeks later, because administratively you just can't move things that quickly, right? Like there was so much happening on the ground that was not covered in terms of the work that was being done by school boards. Okay, so that's the easy answer, like the clean answer. The more complicated answer is this, is that I'm trying, I want to make a distinction between public and private in the way that we understand it as being a kind of US-centric phenomenon. We often, first of all, there's different jurisdictions of education across Canada. In my research, I'm paying so much attention to the variables, the contexts, and that exponentially grew during crisis, right? So across jurisdictions in provinces, things were very different. Within jurisdictions in Ontario, things were very different. But if we're talking sort of in broad strokes of private versus public, Canada, the development of what's been happening in Canada is distinct. So both, have a similar ideology in the sense that there's a growing view of education by and large as a commodity and revenue stream. Its purpose is limited to sort of preparing students for a global economy. But in the context of Canada, it's where you've got, the United States has more actively embraced the private sector when it comes to ed tech. Here we've got more public schools acting more like a business, focusing on generating revenue in order to actually respond to austerity policies. So there's been almost like an imperative for school boards to have to monetize where they can and generate revenue as they can. And so we're not issuing vouchers, but we did during the pandemic direct funds that public schools needed for long-term sustainability into direct household cash transfers. We did, and so that change especially with regard when you're thinking about online education, what does that look like? Terms like modernizing, drawing efficiencies out of the system is often what it's associated with. And what we've seen, there's been a proposal to permanently institute online learning in Ontario, again, distinct from any other jurisdiction in Canada. And it has to do with specifically monetizing it. We have some, like in my research, there's been a very sort of limited instances of this happening in the Toronto District School Board, but it is actually part of the Crown-owned, government-owned independent learning center to deliver online education through more proper private-public partnerships abroad specifically, but then in Ontario, it is going to, if this proposal were to sort of carry through as it's being presented, we would see a significant decrease in the control school boards have over online education, significant loss of teacher time with students, and it would certainly impact the funds that are what's invested in public education. So I sort of think that's really important, because if we think simply as private and public, we kind of miss the details, and the details are really where we need to be organizing around, right, in order to respond.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And that really does connect a lot with Joel's research, which focuses on education as a foundation for our democracy, our foundation for our civic engagement. And that work as of late, Joel, has been even particularly attentive to income inequality. And so we are hearing quite a bit response to, and this connects very much to Behan's work around children falling dangerously behind with the school closures and moving to this emergency remote teaching. And specifically, though, what a lot of people and parents are concerned about is this idea of learning loss. And I'm wondering if you can make a connection between this idea of, okay, what is the bedrock of education for our democracy and this real heightened concern around learning loss?
Yeah, if I had the power to, I would ban learning loss from the vocabulary of everyone in the room, in the Zoom room. Learning loss drives me crazy. It makes me want to pull my hair out, right? I mean, first of all, it drives me crazy because it's so absurdly obvious. I mean, you take kids, take them out of school or move them in and out of school for 15 months in a row, and then compare them to cohorts from, you know, previous years who were in school full time all during that time, and ask whether they've learned the same amount. You know, no, of course they haven't learned the same amount. This is something we all know already. But when we frame the idea of learning loss, we reinforce the idea that learning is about acquiring a set of facts and a set of material that is absolutely essential to live a you know, a life full of meaning and well-being and you know, okayness, and that's just not the case, right? The Norman invasion was in 1066. I happen to know that, but you know what? If I didn't know it, I don't think my life would be impoverished. We have, for decades and decades and decades, been focusing on coverage in the curriculum. We say, here are all the things that kids need to learn. Here's how we're going to teach it to them, when we should be focused on content, right? Research has told us again and again that a deep dive into subjects that are of interest to teacher and students, and that people feel passionate about, deep dives into those topics is much more valuable than, you know, what I'll call it shallow swims in the coverage of the curriculum. We don't all need to know about every ancient civilization, right, that is in the curriculum. It's wonderful to study one ancient civilization so that we learn the process of how that discovery works, and we learn to take joy in that kind of learning. It's not going to be the end of the world if some kids have missed you know, what the role of the mitochondria plays in cell makeup. But what is important is that we pay attention to the fact that kids get opportunities to engage their intellectual and selves and their curiosity into things that matter. So I really appreciate that question, Kristina, because we've been focused on coverage for so long, and we need to be focusing on content. What our schools have to be filled with is content that drives the passion for learning. And when we talk about learning loss, we immediately zero in on you know, pieces of information that maybe were in the curriculum before that might not be in the curriculum tomorrow, and that simply may not matter in the long term of whether students can succeed. We all carry these devices around. We can get information in a matter of seconds, and what we need to be focusing on in learning, both now, you know, during the pandemic and when it ends, is creating curiosity and the skills and knowledge required to sift through the vast amounts of information that's thrown at us, right? Let's remember that we're not in a period where we're suffering from a lack of information. I mean, we are literally drowning in information, right? Because of all these devices and because of some of the wonderful technologies that surround us. So what kids need to learn is how to assess the credibility of that information, how to assess the value of that information, how to use information to pursue things that they're interested in learning. And I think that is one of the major things that the pandemic has made so imminently visible, right? Everyone said, oh my God, the kids are, you know, we can't have kids fall behind. Fall behind who? Fall behind what? These are arbitrary benchmarks that we make. I want to address, you know, before someone makes a straw man argument, to ask me about this, about, you know, well, what about the kids who didn't learn, you know, how to read? Of course, there are basic skills that kids are going to need to learn, and school systems are working very hard to circle back to have those kids learn those things. But the more we talk about learning loss, what happens as a result when we talk about kids falling behind is that middle class, middle class parents with resources run out to get special tutors for their kids. They create learning pods. They decide that one parent is not going to work or is going to go to part-time to work with their kids to get ahead. And kids from under-resourced areas with, you know, two working parents who might be essential workers, they fall further behind, because now the middle-class kids are acquiring all this information, you know, outside of school that these kids aren't learning. So it's just damaging talking about learning loss and talking about being ahead or behind. What we have to focus on is the quality of the education that kids are getting, and the importance of relationships and interpersonal relationships that we've so obviously discovered when they were missing during the pandemic. And that's what we need to focus on. And as others have said, on the well-being of children, right? And on the ability of teachers to focus their attention on that well-being.
I'm just going to assume here, Joel, that you're not a fan of the new Alberta curriculum. There's a lot of shallow swimming happening in that new curriculum. And so I'm going to shift now the panel a little bit, even though I think all of you have already helped us imagine what the priorities need to be going forward and for the future of education. But from what we know, the lessons of the pandemic, what we've seen through the pandemic, I do want to sort of tackle that idea of the new normal. You know, some people say, okay, no, in actual fact, we have had complete continuity. We haven't really made any radical departures from what we did before. And if anything, as some of you have spoken to, perhaps we've actually declined in the current state of education, from the, you know, withdraw of further funding for public education, to the working conditions for teachers, to the learning conditions and well-being of students suffering. And so I'm really hoping we can collectively imagine what the future might be. And so I'm actually going to go back to you, Joel, first. I hope that's okay. And really say that I think this goes a little bit to what Vidya was talking about before, about those complementary pandemics that have been happening at the same time of COVID. And part of that is the rise of popularism, fake news, as you were just referring to, these violent threats to our democracy. We've certainly seen how widespread misinformation has exacerbated and prolonged perhaps what has happened with COVID. And so I'm wondering if you could speak directly to the role of schools in supporting young people through that adjoining pandemic with respect to how they can be really informed, active citizens, and whether that's what we need going forward.
Yeah, I really like the way Vidya and others have framed the, I mean, we do have simultaneous pandemics going on, right? I think I can think of at least 5. I mean, there's diminishing democracy that you referred to, in the rise of populism. There's climate change. There's, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. There's violence against BIPOC peoples from police and others, and it goes on, right? We're experiencing, you know, there was a phrase that someone used, many pandemics, same emergency, right? We're in an emergency kind of situation. And so I'll zero in, since you asked about that, I'll zero in just momentarily on the issue of the role of schools in strengthening our democratic institutions. And I'm broadcasting here right now from Chicago, so I'm in the US, where, of course, on January 6th, one of the more shocking attacks on democracy happened at the US Capitol. But it's, you know, we can't say, oh, you know, it was all Trump or it was all something. This is a worldwide phenomenon. We have Bolsonaro in Brazil. We have rising populist movements all over the world. And I think that schools do have a critical role to play. I mean, the founding purpose of public schools in Canada and the US was in part to educate citizens for a democratic society, right? In totalitarian dictatorships or religious theocracies, you don't need a citizenry to make decisions about social policies, right? The dictator does that, and they do it badly or they do it well, it doesn't matter. But either way, you don't need input from citizens. But citizens in democratic society have different kinds of responsibilities. There's that, old Thomas Jefferson quote where he said that that if the people are not well educated enough to govern their own affairs, then the solution is not to take that power of governance away from them and give it back to the king, it's to educate them. And public schooling in Canada and the United States and in many other democratic countries was seen as essential to make democracy work. And some of the things that students need, the kinds of skills they need to be able to engage in democratic society and to engage civically are things like how to ask difficult questions, right? How to deal with multiple perspectives and think for themselves with others about how to get things done. And for the last 2 decades or so, school reform has moved in a direction that has hamstringed our ability to focus on things like critical thinking, like creative and imaginative thinking, and on interpersonal relationships that can serve as a rocket fuel for democratic life. Instead, we've been myopically focused on standardized testing, mostly in only 2 subject areas, math and literacy. And that's created a kind of education that has been less than it should be. And I think that in the pandemic and with these coinciding crises and coinciding emergencies, we can see the importance of bringing public schooling back to some of the democratic purposes of education on which they were founded.
Thanks, Joel. And this very much relates to Behan, your work around what can we do to restore that democratic purpose when there is an ongoing defunding of public schooling. This has even just happened in Ontario with the fall mini budget by the Conservative government. Can you, sort of looking into the future, be able to speak to some of the short-term, long-term consequences if we continue to defund, and speak to sort of what that reinvestment needs to be?
So I'm a very critical person because I'm really radically hopeful that we're not going to be in a circumstance where we're going to have to look at a kind of long-term conservative vision. But really, I'll say, and sort of been repeating what a lot of others have said, is that we've already been underfunding education for quite some time. There have been a lot of students not served by the system. And it feels to me like in ways we take 4 steps back, 2 steps forward, and still fall a little behind. So we are thinking about the families that are least served. We're thinking about, I think about the Ontario Human Rights Commission, who wrote a series of 2 letters in spring, one sort of at the end of the first series of school closures, and another that was right before the planning was to, or before the 2020-2021 school year planning. And they reminded school boards and the Ministry of Education that they had an obligation to meet the needs of equity deserving students, and asked that those students who are absent from consideration in pandemic education policy be centered. And so I worry that we're already seeing the short term depending on your privilege, right? And depending on your school fundraising and depending on your community's resources. So for some it's working okay. For some it hasn't been working. And we see that, I think, we don't have to necessarily look at test scores, because we can just look at what the access to resources are in the community, because that's going to tell you a lot more than a very limited metric. So I worry that we're not going to sort of, by the end of this, recognize our public education system for what it was. And again, that's more a reflection of our democracy than it is, I think, a governing ideology. I would like to have some hope in democracy and that we can take some of the lessons, but it's really hard to make meaning of, like, even have, for me, like, have a narrative of what's happening during crisis, because A, we're still in it, and B, there's just so many variables we can't account for. So I just sort of have radical hope that there's going to be a collective prioritizing of education. But if not, it's probably going to be a chipping away at it with landmines along the way for our most vulnerable students. And those are the folks that I'm thinking about when advocating for change.
And one of those areas where many of you have already spoken about that we need to advocate for change is around anti-racism. And you're hearing from a lot of anti-racism educators that they do not want a new normal coming out of this, that idea of normality will re-entrench continued white privilege. And so Vidya, this is a lot of the work that you're attentive to. And again, we've seen with the pandemic, this boldness of racism, of Islamophobia, anti-Asian, anti-Black racism. We've seen a boldness of residential school and land claim denialism happening within our society. And again, you think of the root of education to tackle that, not tackle it alone, but to tackle that. What do you see as a way forward of reprioritizing what it means to truly have anti-racist education, specifically in leadership within our schools?
Thank you so much for this question, Kristina. And I want to just name how many educators and leaders who are doing such amazing work to move these conversations forward despite massive resistance. And I, from my Twitter feed alone, get examples that are just so encouraging to think about what is actually possible and what's happening, and what are the ways in which educators every day are working, often without any protection, if anything, in harm's way, to sort of move these conversations forward to protect children. One of the things I think about that's so needed right now, and Behan was talking earlier about how this time has reminded us, and maybe for some of us taught us, how deeply interdependent we are, how deeply interconnected we are. And in thinking about that, we have to be taking an intersectional approach to the work that we're doing. And so we can't understand, for example, anti-racism without understanding anti-colonialism and their connections. And we can't understand, these intersecting oppressions actually generate and create entirely different realities for students and for families and for staff. And so we need to be thinking about our work intersectionally. And that's not simply about the identities of students and families and staff. It's also about the systems of oppression. How are these systems of oppression intertwined? And how do they need each other in order to survive? And so what we're seeing that is, a bit concerning in some schools and in some school boards is, while there might be a focus on anti-Black racism, it's happening without a focus on settler colonialism. Or while there's a focus on settler colonialism, it's happening without a focus on Islamophobia. And so how do we think about the ways in which we can understand the experiences of students by really centering multiple and intersecting systems of oppression? And what that does is it invites us to think about, when we say all students, which students do we mean? And when we say all Indigenous students, which students do we mean? There's always going to be sort of perceived ideological limits to what we mean by Muslim students, by Black students, by Asian students, and how can we start to really disrupt what those ideological barriers have been. And that's going to require a lot of self-reflexivity. And I think that this is something that is so necessary. I am such a proponent of structural change and of policy change, but I know that those changes are only as good as the level of consciousness of people that are engaging with that work and continuously revising and rethinking policies and structures. And so part of the importance of self-reflexivity is what Kevin Kumashiro speaks about. And he talks about this idea that even as we are working towards anti-oppressive aims, we have to be thinking about the ways in which we are creating oppression. And so in anything that we are doing, we are continuously questioning the complicities in oppression. And what that invites is a level of honesty about, the connections, about the contradictions, about the nuances, about power asymmetries. And it invites a kind of questioning and a kind of unsettling in which there isn't an easy answer. It unsettles this idea that there is a normal, that there is one version of schooling, that there is one version of democracy, that there is one. It unsettles this very idea that that there's any one way of understanding how we might live and be in the world. Right? And I would say the last thing is this idea of not just moral courage, but also political will. Right? And this is not about like a badge of honor saying that I'm doing good work, or claiming allyship with the community. This is not about doing the bare minimum so that we can not be called racist, or not be called classist, or not be called harmful. For leaders that are doing this work with integrity in a sort of transformative and liberatory way, it requires a really different kind of engagement, and oftentimes that comes with risks to professional advancement. It comes with risks to their protection. And this is the type of leadership that's needed to challenge oppressive structures, because as that change happens, we are going to see community backlash. We are going to see resistance from within the school board. And there needs to be a co-constitutive way of being that can withstand that and work with that. And of course, that will come with different strategies and different tactics that are going to be, more and less helpful, but there has to be a willingness to go there. And part of that is rethinking our notion of leadership from this individual maverick leader that's going to go out there and save everything, that's going to go out there and be, have the personality to sort of turn everyone around. It requires us to think of leadership as a collective, as communities in which power is shared. And when we can move more and more in that way, when we can recognize that it's not about this individual person, but it's communities and collectives and collective consciousness that's changing, I think we have a lot of hope in terms of what this could look like.
Absolutely. I mean, that whole idea of being comfortable with being unsettled as a way forward, I think might speak to a lot of people. And I think that vision of leadership is very much what I have been hearing is there's a hopefulness in Llewellyn, your leadership at the Waterloo School Board, and your work in doing that sort of collective, bringing people together towards that vision. And so one of the questions I had for you actually relates to one of the questions I've already seen come up in the active Q&A, which is really about what does this look like to embrace being future focused, to be an innovator for social justice? Like, how do we do this change making? And since it seems like there is, with that sense of Behan talking about this is your radical hopefulness, and it seems to be a moment. So what could that change making look like? How do we do that collectively?
Thanks. It's such a good question, a big one, and coming after so many thoughtful comments, there's so many things my mind's racing in a few different ways things that I want to say. Let me maybe just start like this. We're using right now 200-year-old infrastructure, and then we're claiming to prepare kids for life towards the 22nd century. We're still talking about the 21st century, even though we're a quarter of the way into the 21st century, we're still talking about 21st century competencies. And so one of the things that we've started doing is we're stopping talking about 21st century competencies because we're a quarter of the way in, but starting to think about what is the learner profile? What are those characteristics that we want our students, after they have a career with us, to be able to graduate into the world to? Who are these leaders that we're graduating through our system, who will go out into the world? And to build on something that, you know, Dr. Shah was saying around the idea of, you know, this isn't the work of any one leader. And I think oftentimes when we talk about the work of equity or sovereignty work as it relates to truth and reconciliation that we need to do in education, that we talk about this big moral imperative. And yes, it is a moral imperative. It is also our professional and duty to do so. We are being paid to do this. This is part of what we must do in order for public education to truly reflect all of the students that we serve. And so, you know, amongst our team, we talk about our circle of leadership and the wisdom of that circle, that no one of us is going to have all of the answers, but the collective of us are able to do so. And so, you know, I'm very blessed to be amongst a team and a co-leader, you know, the Associate Director, Lila Reed, and you know, we talk really regularly about what does it mean to bring reflective practice into our leadership practice? What does it mean for us to be, as leaders, thoughtful about who we represent and how can we center the most marginalized voices, understanding that when we do so, what is necessary for some is good for all. We've accepted that in the context of special education, but we seem to struggle, we the large collective, we seem to struggle when we talk about, you know, particular groups of students who continue to struggle till this day, right? You know, when I and I think Joel and I might be saying the same thing, maybe using different language, I would say that, you know, what we don't want to focus in school is, you know, like all this content. We need to focus on concepts, and we need to have an integrated curriculum that is tied to real world learning. So if we understand that we're preparing kids for life in a world that we don't understand the problems that they're going to face, that they're going to hold jobs that we don't know that even exist, to solve problems that haven't even happened yet, how can we still continue to teach them using textbooks, some of which are teaching wrong information, right? Some of which, quite frankly, are out of date, right? And so, you know, you fast forward and you think about the fact that we're going to have a growing issue around environmental refugees as global warming happens, and some countries completely disappear because of the rising levels of water. Where do those people go to? What citizenship will they be? Where would they have resources? Like, you know, these are real issues that our children are going to have to solve, right? What happens when people start fighting over water, and what does that mean to, you know, and how do we really engage? What is Indigenous sovereignty in a world that has never been just to Indigenous people? What does that look like? And I, you know, believe that the answers lie with our students and lie in the communities whose voices have often gone, you know, often unheard or silenced. And it's not about giving people voice. Everyone has a voice. Who we choose to listen to, that's a completely different thing altogether, right? And so how do we help to make sure that, you know, we build or we revision what education could look like? We're at an exciting moment, you know, for me and for us as an organization, where we're going through our strategic planning process. And one of the things we're trying to do is really listen to what students are going to tell us. And to reimagine, you know, one of the questions that I was grappling with today as I was working through some of the stuff for this plan is, what if we could redefine what school means? Is school the building? Is school the curriculum? What if school wasn't either of those things, but that was just a part of what school was? Who else would school, you know, how else would we think about it? Where does it mean that it's all physical or some of it digital, right? What does that begin to look like? How do you create a sense of community? How do we, you know, like we're still doing, you know, what I consider to be archaic things, like we're grouping children by age. Why are we doing that? Like, why in 2021, why do we still group children by age when we should be looking at the abilities that children have? Why have we not revamped our entire special education processes, which are built on a deficit model of understanding neurovariants, children of different abilities, right? Why are we still there? How do we then begin to think about the promise and the potential of public education to actually dramatically change the landscape and create leaders who can go forward and make changes in the world? And what would that begin to look like? And then why might that be threatening to some, and for whom, right? And that needs to be the question, because really, when we understood this through the work that we've done in special education for such a long time, we knew that if we had to make some changes for some children, all children would benefit. And so if we start by understanding that we have to center the voices that have been harmed the most, that have been underserved the most, right, that we are going to make it better for all children. And this is the objective, right? How do we make it better for all students so that we can move towards the world that we want, the world that we're aspiring and dreaming towards? And I think those are, just a few things. And, I would, venture to say, how do we begin to reimagine schools as the heart and hub of the community? And what does it mean to have wraparound support for children so that a child can grow to be their full self, whatever that full self is, without having to justify their body and justify their worth, right? We should no longer be able to use identity as a predictor for outcome. And for the last 50 years, we can use identity and predict largely outcome. And that's where the heart of we are absolutely at the moment where we can make change. And I think one of the things that we need is we need more voices speaking with us and speaking on behalf of this, so that we get away from this win or lose, you or me, us versus them. But no, we're moving to a collective better place for all of us. Now, when we do this for some of our children, we will do better for all of our children, and we will do better for the world that we want.
And as I look at the question and answer section, what I see, and I'm reading from a lot of people, is, which is very hopeful and wonderful, is this, like, they're energized to know, okay, how do we do this collectively? What does this change look like? How do we do this? But how do we do this in the face of what feels very, there's lots of despair about the underfunding and exhausted teachers. So how do we support educators in making that change in schools? How do we rally the will of that collective to make changes? So I guess some of the questions that are being asked are, could all of you maybe at this point speak to maybe one thing that you see as sort of something that we can do to support us during what feels like, as one person described, a multifaceted, rather than multiple pandemics, a multifaceted pandemic happening all at once? What can we do that would provide hopefulness of change? I'll sort of let you jump into that question.
I can start. First of all, it's one of my favorite sort of outcomes of the pandemic is witnessing people's renewed appreciation of the work that teachers do, and the recognition that teaching is essential work, right? I mean, teaching is essential work. I mean, do you remember some of the memes that were going around at the beginning? Things like homeschooling day 3, we should double our teacher's salary. Or one of my favorites was, homeschooling day 7, I want to apologize for the teacher for insisting that Susie was gifted, and things like that. But there's this real renewed appreciation for the work that teachers do. And I think one thing that we could do, because I also glanced through the questions, and a lot of people were also talking about the importance of relationships and the community building in classrooms that has to happen, and bringing kids back into the fold of, reestablishing the connections and relationships that were lost through such an extended period of social isolation. And so one thing we can do to do that is to treat teachers like the professionals they are, give them far more autonomy they're on the front lines with kids to understand the specific needs of their students and their students' families, to rebuild those relationships, not to have their hands tied by a curriculum that's overly linked to an outdated focus on testing and standardizing for the curriculum. Because what we need is not standardized classrooms. We need almost the opposite. We need teachers to be able to draw on the experiences, on their passions and experiences, and on their students' passions and experiences, to build connections to students and their families, and to focus on deep dives into things that matter, and to rebuild community that was lost during this time. And I'm hopeful for that.
Does anyone else want to jump into that conversation?
Sure, I can jump in as well. And Joel, thank you so much for saying that around the professionalism of teachers and honoring that. And that requires, that requires governments, that requires the public, that requires us as educators to treat each other as professionals who are most closely connected to students and can make decisions that are in their best interest. And of course, in communities, right? There's this idea that, teachers are human too, and they are exhausted right now. Leaders are exhausted. We're all experiencing this in different ways. And I think part of the change that's required is to recognize that and to address that and to put things in place so that teachers are not feeling surveyed by various people, public, that are administrators and senior leaders, each other. And so I think that this is an opportunity where this is not an us versus them. I think to truly shift how we're thinking about education in this time is to recognize that schooling is ultimately a human endeavor. And we need to be able to make space for educators as human beings with very real lived experiences that they are working through every day. And that is part of the change. And when we can start to really build those connections between a teacher's well-being and a child's well-being and a community's well-being, when we can start to see the way that these things don't need to be in opposition to each other, but actually need each other to sustain, it offers a different way for us to think about this.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a few things. At this current moment, I would say that, how do we show appreciation for the folks who are doing this work is going to be really important. And that is not taking away the work that we have to do and the learning that we have to do. But it is recognizing that people are being stretched really thin right now with not enough resources and not enough of the right types of supports. How do we, begin to think about the ways that we still hold accountable? I don't have an issue as the director to be held accountable. Also understanding the context of the situation and being able to make room for, there's an interesting way these dynamics sort of unfold. And when people especially go into public spaces and they use inflammatory language, they're actually causing more harm and more hurt to people as we're trying to do this work. So it's not don't hold people accountable. It's not let's not have the hard conversations, but let's also recognize the moment, right? Yes, educators are superheroes, and all the online, frontline staff, right? Our EAs, our CYWs, all of our support workers, our custodians, our office staff, our principals, people are burning out right now. They need that extra help. we also need that, you know, our community voices to show appreciation and to speak up when the right things are happening publicly as well. Like I always appreciate the really quiet notes that I get saying, we're really supporting these moves you're making. And I'm like, thank you so much. I appreciate hearing from you. I also would appreciate if you say that publicly so that people know that this is important for all of the children that we're serving, you know, and to help us to build that collective sense of courage so that we do this together. You know, I'll remind you, when we just wanted to make one change in the anthem in this country, from all thy sons command to all of us, right? Just that, and just a huge backlash that just that had caused, right? For trying to do something that would actually make it more inclusive and make it better. And, you know, there's all this language that kind of floats around that, right? You know, it is about how do we honor the children, honor the communities, and really rethink the spaces. And I will say, you know, in my sort of going out into the field and meeting people and talking, there's a lot of will and want to try to do better. There's a lot of understanding around we need to do more learning here, for which there needs to be support. You know, I would say, you know, we need to be thinking about what ways we, like, I honestly, and I might get in trouble for saying this, I don't know why we would do EQAO in a year like this, where schools are stretched thin, where educators are stretched thin, where children's mental health is suffering, and we're going to add this other really complex layer, right, on top of everything else that people are doing. And I think this connects back to what Vidya was saying. Like, you know, there has to be humanity here. There has to be compassion. We have to see this as a collective project. And we can't, you know, it is hard. We will make mistakes. We need to be able to apologize, but we need also that collective will to keep pushing us to do better so that we do better, because nothing that's happened over the last 40 years, we still can't point to one district that has systemically changed outcomes for those groups of students. Not one district anywhere. So I think that is the opportunity we have right now. We can do it. And I know there's a lot of want for it. And honestly, like right now, you know, this is the big thing that we're struggling with. How do we balance this? And with all the compassion and love and care for our frontline staff who are working ridiculous hours to try and do the best that they could in a system that needs more resources.
And pulling off of that, what we're seeing in the Q&A is that people are saying, you know, that whole idea of EQAO, we're still going forward with that traditional grading and report cards. And, you know, which we've seen, especially during the pandemic. I was struck by it with my children about it being just grades of privilege and what that has meant, but also what it's meant for a lot of, again, getting back to sort of that learning loss. What does that mean for a lot of the other the subjects that are needed for us to live sort of in that humanity? What about the arts? What about music? Those seem to completely get pushed aside in what we see as the future of education when we're really focused on that recovery of literacy and numeracy. So are we ready for that radical departure? So what, you know, do we just continue on ahead with the same grading and we continue to have that focus on literacy and numeracy and set aside what the arts look like? Maybe I'm looking for a little of Behan's, you know, radical hopefulness here.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, Llewellyn. That, I mean, we're not going to learn anything from the EQAO administered this year. We already know the answers to everything that's going to come up, and it's misguided and cruel and counterproductive to be spending time and people's energy on EQAO testing, and the same with every other province and states in the U.S. Because I saw from the comments some people are tuning in from the U.S. as well.
So I will, I guess, add to what folks are saying insofar as which I think the question was around like where the change. So for me, it feels very overwhelming, right? Like, because the change is, there's not again, we can change absolutely everything that happens in schools, but it's not going to result in the outcomes we need if we're not transforming the communities schools are in. And that, like, there has to be, I think, appreciation for the ways that schools are shaped from the communities that they're in. And so that when we're thinking about the change, I do think there is a collective, so the things that we all agree upon, generally speaking, is that public education is important. Public healthcare is important. Maybe schools shouldn't be the sites, like maybe we shouldn't, when we're thinking about food security, maybe we need to think about the roots of food security and not necessarily depend on schools to be the bandage. So I will, in some ways, and maybe I'm a bit more expansive in thinking that you can actually enact change in education by advocating for a livable wage. You can advocate for change in public education by advocating for, dignified disability supports. Like, you can advocate. So just not thinking about necessarily the kind of proper realm of schooling. And in that way, also sort of referencing the idea of where schooling takes place or education takes place, and appreciating that education takes place in a variety of spaces outside of the proper idea of school. And so, yeah, when I'm thinking about where, first of all, I'd say change is how you're always making change, because you're always moving and being moved. And also change happens it doesn't happen in a 180, right? It happens in degrees. And so that wherever you have proximity to, whatever you have impact on, given your relative privilege and power, that is going to make a difference, so long as our values are aligned. And if we are understanding as a collective the importance of public goods, such as education and healthcare, and like the necessaries of life, that we can not necessarily feel like things are so overwhelming. And I think that is often what, when I'm working with students, even this term, and trying to just get them to think about change, it's incremental. I'm not asking them to go and think about the hierarchy. And I think also thinking about change as hierarchy, moving it into a more horizontal, onto a horizon, might be a bit more manageable.
I'll just jump in here as well. I think that we've been talking so much in this panel about mental health and well-being, about relationships, about imagining new futures, and that necessitates the arts. That lives in the arts. That lives in a place where we can be different people, we can express different parts of ourselves, we can come to know different parts of ourselves as individuals and as a collective. And I think of the work of amazing organizations like Art Not Shame that are, and what this organization does is it helps young people work through, various things that they're grappling with around mental health through the arts. And if there's such a focus on well-being and relationships right now, I don't know how we can do that without centering the arts in all of its forms.
Thanks very much to both of you. And when you were speaking, all I kept thinking is, that really long-term narrative of schools are failing us. And that's almost been doubled down during the pandemic. And we rarely take a moment to say we are failing our schools. And so what do we do if we are failing our schools? And it's not just that schools are failing us, because those really it is so embedded in what we envision for what we want from our community in that broader sense of activism, Behan, that you were talking about as well. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I apologize sincerely that we weren't able to get to many more of the questions, even though I tried to sort of sneak some in and cluster them. But it's just been such a rich conversation. I thought a really good way that perhaps we could conclude or end is if, and I know this is always a challenge and a hard thing to ask of people, but is there one lesson, or perhaps even more difficult to ask, is there one phrase, one word that would help sort of encapsulate what you would provide for a sense of hopefulness of what the future of education can be as we hopefully emerge out of this pandemic in the not too distant future? So I'll let whoever wants to jump in there first.
I'll go with one word: relationships. Schools need to focus on relationships, and I think that the lesson we've learned from this pandemic is the importance of that, and thinking about kids' connections to the teacher and to each other, and the well-being that entails.
I'll say crossroads. So crisis, the etymology is crossroads, which means that there's decisions that we can make, and that's empowering.
Did you want to go?
No, you go.
You go. I think for me, it's this idea of embracing not having a normal, really unsettling this idea of a normal, and continuing to question the very logics and calculus and grammar and all of the hidden rules that make up systems of oppression that have long been made invisible to us purposely, to question them, and as we do so, to unsettle this idea that there should ever be a normal, that there should ever be a one way forward.
Hope has to be a big part of it. Hope and healing. We have to recognize schools as sites that have created trauma, and we have a responsibility to work on healing that trauma. But I think, and it could be, my hopefulness. I think we are at a moment where we have an invitation to be and to do better for the students that we serve. And, if I could be so bold, I'll say, keep your eyes on WRDSB, because I think we're going to do some really cool things coming up. We have a really amazing community. We have amazing leaders in our system. Our students more and more are just, we keep trying to think of how they can show up. And I'm super, super hopeful, around how we can shift public education. And like Behan said, it's in degrees at a time, but we'll get there. And we're committed to doing that hard and necessary work, relationships and being in service to our students and our communities.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. I guess I'm trying to sum up what you just said, but that idea that we have a decision to make to unsettle normal and seek hopeful relationships just kind of feels like a great way to summarize what we've talked about, and the idea that a lack of hope is really what gets us stuck in the past and unable to see a way to actually make change. So I want to thank all of you so much. It's really been such a rich and rewarding conversation for me, and I hope it has been for everyone who's in attendance. I should note that this has been recorded and it will be shared on the Renison YouTube channel and through social media. So thank you all for being in attendance. Thank you all to the panelists for offering your incredible expertise. And we'll be watching and we'll be supporting and participating in the change making. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Kristina. Good night, everyone.
Nice seeing you all. Good night, everyone. Thanks for organizing, Kristina.
Thank you.
Are you ready to all go out for a beer?
If only.